Hello and welcome to the History Revision podcast on Alexander III and his reaction to his father's reforms. What was Alexander III like? He's been described as honest, unimaginative and sincere. He was the second son and he wasn't supposed to be Tsar. Alexander II's eldest son died in 1865, so he did have 15 years to prepare. But Alexander III was originally trained to be in the army and was very military minded. After he became heir presumptive, he was tutored by Pobedonostsev, also known as a Grand Inquisitor or the Black Tsar, who was a firm upholder of autocracy and repression, and taught that any concessions would be an indication of cowardice and failure. He fell out with his father over his father's mistress, and this reinforced his conservative side, and he was known for his conservatism even before his father's death. He had opposed the reforms of his father when his father was still alive. He had watched his father die, and he was scared of revolutionaries. He moved to Getchina, the fortress outside St. Petersburg, to make him feel safer. And this fear of the revolutionaries made him even more conservative still. He believed his father had been too liberal and paid for that with his life. However, he was strong physically with a commanding character. How did he react to reform and become repressive then? Well, he made it clear at the start that he would accept no limitations on his autocracy and was determined to reinforce his authority. He began his reign with the hanging of 5 members of the People's Will who had been involved in his father's assassination, which was part of a bigger crackdown on terrorists in general. Under the influence of Pobedonostsev, he immediately rejected the Loris Malika proposal for a constituent assembly, or Duma, and instead produced a manifesto promising to reassert the principles of autocracy. Loris Malikov resigned within 2 months, as did Dmitry Milutin, another liberal under Alexander II. He set up the safeguard system, which was not simply just a short-term solution, and it included 2 stages of emergency, giving governor-generals and police extraordinary powers, and this lasted all the way up into the February Revolution in 1917. The 2 levels were a reinforced safeguard and then a higher level, extraordinary safeguard. The governors and police could close down and fine the local press, arrest and imprison suspects for 3 months, and under the extraordinary safeguard they could close down the Duma and Zemstva and dismiss any official under the first 3 ranks in table of ranks. The reinforced safeguard immediately applied to 10 provinces in 1881, and Russia became kind of like a police state. He was trying to turn back the clock to a time when Western values were not eroding the power of the Tsars, and strong centralised control was reasserted. The police and nobility were given a central role. The nobility, due to land captains. In 1889, land captains were recruited from the nobility, and they had the ability to override Zemstva in elections and in their decisions. They could overturn judicial judgments and impose punishments, for example, the flogging of peasants for minor offences such as non-payment of taxes, and they could also overrule the Mir. The land captains were greatly resented by the peasants. In 1885, a Ukase gave the Ministry of Justice more control over judicial process and reintroduced closed courts so that no reporting cases was allowed. It also reintroduced courts without juries for a larger number of crimes, whereas before, under Alexander II, it had only been for terrorism or political crimes. In 1889, magistrates were removed and their powers were given to land captains. Zemstva's independence was undermined in 1890, and the peasant vote was reduced. Though the land captains didn't replace the Duma and Zemstva, and this kind of typifies the contradictory nature of the reaction under Alexander III. The police's role. Well, Alexander III's government was committed to eradicating revolutionary activity, and new legislation was introduced to extend police powers. The new Okhrana, which is a secret police mainly in St. Petersburg, Moscow and Warsaw, became larger and more feared, as well as the gendarmerie, which is a security police, and that was all over the empire, and the army were also given more powers. Any area of the empire could be deemed an area of subversion, where the gendarmerie police could search, arrest, detain, imprison and exile any person they suspected might even have been planning to commit a crime, or was related to people who had committed crimes, and these people had no right at all to legal representation. The Okhrana could even use torture and execute people without trial. Pobedonostsev refused to recognise that people's lives should be improved, as he thought that it was wrong to raise expectations. Bread prices were kept down in good harvest years on purpose. Vishnegradsky's export drive and indirect taxes hurt peasants. The indirect taxes were increased. Newspapers, had been warned 3 times, had to submit their papers to the censors a day before publication. And he controlled education to restrict opposition ideas amongst intellectuals. Fees were increased to restrict university access. There was a stress on religion in education. Barrack-like atmosphere was created at universities, lower class children were effectively banned from secondary education, higher courses for women were closed, and the church were given more control over education. So that's the reaction. Where did he actually continue reform though? Well, Alexander III and Pobedonetsev rejected completely the creeping liberalism under Alexander II, but they didn't reverse many of the reforms of his father, and where there was counter-reform it tended to be more like conservative amendments. It would have been, for example, unthinkable to reimpose serfdom. In some places, though, the reform even continued, albeit quite slowly. Land captains can be seen, by some historians, as an attempt to bring about efficient local government, as tax collections had become more corrupt and absenteeism from Zemstva was rising. Education was spread, and there was government promotion of technical colleges and universities. There were the first Russian labour laws. There's some legislation on workers' rights, which was limited, but it included things like not working at night or regulation on children or women workers, and it set up an inspectorate to check that this was actually happening. The peasants and the noble land banks in 1883 and 1885 respectively were introduced to enable both of them to buy land and develop larger farms. Often this just led to more debt. The peasant land bank had allowed 1/3 all landlord estates to be bought up by 1904. The nobles in their land bank even had cheaper rates than the peasant land bank. Zemstva at this time was improving healthcare and primary education, although this isn't a government initiative. It wasn't stopped. And Bungay introduced tax reform which reduced the burden on the peasantry. Poll tax was abolished and inheritance tax was introduced. Economic reform under Bungay, Vishnegradsky and Witte shows that there was some reform, especially in the economy, and redemption payments were reduced under Bungay. So what was Russification? The Slavophile Pobedonetsev was a fierce critic of the West and its liberal ways. He preferred the autocracy, orthodoxy and nationality of a writer called Uvarov, who wrote that in 1833. He admired how Bismarck had used nationalism in Germany and thought it was essential for the success of a country for everybody to be moulded into a single nationality. He tried to do what Britain had done, assimilating the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish, etc., and he wanted all Russians to be loyal Russian subjects. He was supported by nobles who wanted order and uniformity, supported by soldiers who were concerned with security, especially on the borders, and he was supported by Orthodox priests who wanted to get rid of religious dissenters. Other nationalities suffered attempts to destroy their national culture and language: Poland, Finland and Belarusia, Georgia and Ukraine, for example. Risings of the nationalities were mercilessly repressed. In some places, like the Caucasian and the Turkic people in the southwest, it was relatively easy because they were uneducated and now they could be taught to read and write in Russian. Central Asia had been conquered and could be treated as a colony. But because there were more than 100 ethnic minorities and only 44% of the population were Russian, it was extremely difficult to do it everywhere. And in most places, the impact of Russification was negative. The Caucasus, the Baltic provinces and Finland, where there were mass protests when Russification attempted to abolish its separate army and impose Russian as language, more forcefully, as well as getting rid of their diet, the Finnish component of local government. It didn't work. Poland was the worst hit area. Most of the new laws were totally impractical. Only Polish language lessons could be taught in Polish, for example, and everything else had to be in Russian. Many Poles joined opposition groups, socialist, Marxist and nationalist, and nowhere was opposition to Russification more popular or better organised than in Poland. Pobedonetsev was also an anti-Semite, and the Jews were the worst sufferers of Russification. Pogroms broke out in 1881 in Ukraine and quickly spread. The government did little to stop them. In some cases, they might have been encouraged by the Okhrana, who concocted something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that actually pretended to be a Jewish plot for global domination. These happened for 3 years and then sporadically after that. The Holy League, with the support of Pobedonetsev, organised lootings, vandalism, beatings, rapings and killings. But actually Alexander III didn't approve and banned the Holy League in 1882. The Black Hundreds were a nationalist group who were notorious for their attacks on the Jews. And laws were actually brought in to discriminate against the Jews. In 1882, for example, the Jews' right to acquire property was restricted, and it confined most Jews again to the Pale Assessment. Most were denied the vote, restricted access to university, and most of them could not complete degree courses. Jewish schools were closed. These measures were supposed to be temporary, but they lasted until 1917. And many of the Jews were also driven towards revolutionary groups, for example, Trotsky. Russification may have had some appeal to the Russians, but it was largely destructive and did not make loyal subjects. Alexander, ironically, has been called a peacemaker because his reign was uniquely peaceful in foreign policy.